You're listening to The State of Work, the podcast by Lano. The State of Work is about finding your place in the changing world of work as an individual or an organisation. In each episode, we dive into some of the benefits and limitations we face when it comes to remote and flexible work. We'll discuss how we work, how we hire and manage people, and how we live in this increasingly global workplace. I'm your host, Maddie Duke, and in this episode we hear from Ricardo Fenandez, General Manager in Spain at Limehome, a business that's leading the digital revolution in the hospitality industry to define new standards in convenience, comfort and design. Ricardo is someone with over 10 years of experience in working remotely and managing distributed teams. In a previous position, Ricardo led a global expansion into the US and India while working remotely from Spain. In his current position at Limehome, Ricardo is tasked with building and scaling a new business with the added challenge of a global pandemic. Ricardo shared with me some helpful advice for building a team and scaling a business when you yourself are remote. The State of Work is brought to you by Lano, an important tool for building and scaling remote teams. Lano makes it easy to hire the best talent on the planet, wherever they may be. I'm speaking now with Ricardo Fenandez, currently based in Madrid. Ricardo has a long career in remote work, having lived in about 7 different countries and managing teams of people across many countries and time zones. Ricardo, thanks for joining me on The State of Work.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me, Maddie.
Thank you. So, Ricardo, you were hired as the general manager in Spain at Limehome right when the pandemic was really taking hold of the world in 2020 and tasked with scaling the team there. Can you tell me what that was like?
So I started with Limehome the 1st of April of last year. We had agreed, I think, end of January, start of February to start up in April. And obviously, when I had agreed,
you weren't planning on a pandemic.
The pandemic hadn't really started. No. I mean, you started hearing a few things that were happening, but no. The idea was, to set up an office, set up a team, scale really fast, and obviously, the first question I had on the 1st of April was, do we even begin, and how does begin actually? What does it look like? So it definitely changed a lot at the start. We basically kind of took a step back and said, okay, well, there's 100 different scenarios of how this could play out, from the most aggressive, horrible one of like doomsday scenario to like, hey, this will recover in 1 month. So the first decision that we made is like, let's play this out, month by month, review how things are going to scale and grow. So both myself and the head of business development, we kicked it off in Spain. We realized what the current situation is, so we didn't actually start full time. We started working 3-4 days a week to kind of manage a little bit the growth. But we started doing our job. We started doing our job remotely. Funnily enough, we were both based in Madrid, the head of business development, myself. But the head of business development got stuck in Malaga in the south of Spain because he's originally from there. And a year and 1 month afterwards, he's still living there. So things that weren't being planned actually happen, and it's going extremely well, excellent, and we organize it very well to work remotely and travel to Madrid, etc. But we had to plan on a day to day, how things were evolving and making the right decisions.
Yeah, and I mean, talking about that, like, how do you? Like, what kind of steps do you take when you're working remotely and trying to scale a new business in a new location?
So luckily, this isn't my first working from home experience. I've been doing this for 10 years now. So this is actually my 4th company that I've been scaling remotely. The first one was a company based in Barcelona, which is kind of easy back in the day in 2012. Then I worked with an Italian company, and then for 6 years, I was scaling a company called Prodigy Finance, where I was based in Madrid. I was employee number 25, and we grew to 300 people, all while based in Madrid with teams in in New York, which I scaled in Cape Town, in London, in India, and around Europe. So that, so it, I mean, it was definitely something not new for me. What was new is that everyone was doing it, and that was what was really interesting. So before, I always used to have to combine, a 24-hour trip to go see someone, especially when you're growing and scaling. You're doing a lot of business development, talking to partners, talking to clients, learning what to do. The challenge that we had here is that everyone was stuck at home. So it would have been very complicated. The mentality of the last 10 years was still happening, but the reality is that everyone was getting onto Zoom. Everyone was talking virtually. Obviously, people with different technological savviness, but we were able to start doing our business development, which is basically talking to property owners, funds, real estate developers about renting, which is the part of business development that Limehome does, which basically it rents out properties from 10 to 100 apartments from large owners for 10 to 20 years, and then rents them out in short-term and mid-term stays. So we were able to do that from our house. So in the middle of the crazy pandemic that hit Madrid, which was April, May, and even June, I was at home and doing 5, 6 Google and Zoom Hangout meetings, which would have never, ever, ever happened before because of the way that the real estate industry gets played out. That you shake hands, you have a lunch, you talk about business, you talk about the world. And this was all happening on Zoom. And actually, we got to close our first deals, our first properties, all while doing these things remotely, which would never happen. So I think there was a change in mindset that allowed this remoteness to work, which is going to continue in the future for sure.
Yeah. And have you had to hire people remotely as well? Like what's it like kind of growing internally when everyone's remote?
Yeah, so we made the conscious decision at the start in April. So let's hire when we need people. We obviously need to manage the cash flow. It's, we don't know if this is going to be a 12-month scenario, a 24-month scenario, 2-month scenario. So as the head of business development myself, so we started scaling. And we actually hired our first employee, a junior person to help us grow in May. And we made the conscious decision, which is a complicated one, was to actually base this person in Germany, because we are actually a German company, for two very important reasons. And this was big learnings for me. I think having worked remotely the last few years, helped me to quickly make decisions. But it made no sense to have an office in Spain at that time. We were working from our house. We couldn't even leave the house in many instances. So getting a co-working where we wouldn't be able to interact, wasn't great. And actually in Germany, the COVID situation was much easier. People were going to the office a lot more often. The first wave that hit Spain, was actually quite light in Germany. So there was still that culture work environment happening in our German headquarters with about 100 people working there. And the second one is that it was a junior person. So, one of my learnings working remotely is that hiring and training junior people is quite tough when you're not spending physical time with them. It's not just about teaching them, about the company, interacting with clients, but it's about how do you work? How do you send an email? How do you manage a meeting? How do you talk to clients? How do you interact in the office?
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. You got to think that a lot of people that are, just out of university, they've sent emails from their university, but they never sent a work email. They never talked. They never, in a work scenario, they've never been in a meeting. So we would not be able to provide that comfort and that learning experience that most junior people need in the first couple of months without being in an office environment, or at least a hybrid office environment of a couple of days a week. So we made the conscious decision of basing this person in Germany.
Right. So that person could have access to other team members and learn those things.
Exactly.
It's funny, to think back on, for sure. I know personally the foundations of the way I approach professional communications and emailing definitely stems from my first sort of career job out of studying,
Yeah, being able to interact with your colleagues, being able to see what the boss is doing.
And just turn to the next person and say, does this look does this look right to you? Or, should I email this person or go to them or call them? Or lots of questions that juniors would probably have. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're in a vacuum, it's hard to know what is right or wrong in many circumstances. And the worst thing is doing something, for 5 or 6 days that is not the best way to do it. So having that, those other people around really gives that support system, which is one of the challenges of scaling remote teams with junior people.
Yep. Do you think that there's a place for local get-togethers or remote kind of co-working, or sorry, not remote, but like for remote employees who do live in similar areas to kind of get together and co-work together, or even to create a local office? Like, what do you think that the role of a physical office has in remote teams, even if it's not the head office?
Yeah, so after the first 5-6 tough months of COVID, I'll share my my personal experience, and then I'll share kind of two big points which I think are relevant here for for remote working and kind of organizing events. So after 5 or 6 months, we actually got a co-working. It made sense. That was always the plan, and we've had it. We sometimes there's 2 people, sometimes there's 0, sometimes it's 8 of us in the office, but a place where people can mix, people can interact. We can define our culture. We can transfer that that company culture from Germany. So I think there's a huge value of these local offices, and I think they're fundamental for scaling successful startups and scaling successful companies. Being in a co-working, that's up to the size of the company, what their needs are. I think being in a company when you're a small group and with the current situation of the hybrid model makes even more sense, just because you get also the impact, the energy of other people in the co-working. Sometimes imagine, you're a team of 10 people, you go to a co-working, you're by yourself that day, only 2 people. In the co-working, even if you have your own office, you get that, that energy, that vibes, that interaction with other people at the co-working. So I think there's a huge value even in the future model of remote working to have that co-working. And even if by yourself, like the next country we set up, I think there would be a lot of value to have a co-working place. And this is where the whole hybrid model, which I'm a fan of, I think comes into play. I think there'll definitely be hybrid work situations going forward, and that's what employees will demand. So definitely remote offices and the co-working. And then there'll actually be another big need, which will be of organizing events and get-together. So you might not need anymore a huge headquarter office that can have all of the people locally coming in the home office and spending time together. There could be this concept of event places where you go for 2-3 days, maybe 2 times a year, to develop those strong working relationships, that culture, that trust, that getting to know each other with a little bit of like social mixing, etc. And that doesn't need to happen in headquarters anymore. It could be in another place, but it's about that physical interaction that will make companies be more successful. So I think this is a really interesting concept that hasn't really played out much in the past because it hasn't been a need. It's always in the headquarters, which I think will get some attention in the coming years.
Yeah. Have you ever engaged in virtual team building exercises? Have you got some good examples of what companies can do, like especially right now where a lot of team members might not still be able to travel depending on the COVID situation where they are?
Yeah, so I'll share 3 different scenarios. Successes, failures, and something in between. So cool. I think companies need to try it. So I'll start off with the failure. So in Germany, things have become quite tough with restrictions. So a lot less people in the office, and for a young team like Limehome, we needed that interaction. So we tried to use a software where we try to recreate this situation of being in an office where you actually were logged in all day. You would move yourself from like a virtual table to another virtual table. You could interact and see where people are. We pushed it out to the organization, about 100 people. Complete failure. No interaction, no need. It was to force. There wasn't a natural evolution of it, especially because we have other tools like email, like Slack, like Google, etc., where we get enough of that interaction. So a pure software solution was a complete failure in my opinion. And after I think 3 days or 5 days of trying it out, it was good that we tried it, but we realized it didn't work out. Then, so an event that actually was quite successful was we had a Christmas party, purely virtual, 3 hours, where there were close to 100 of us in it. And two things that made it very successful. We had a great host. So it was someone on the people team, and she did an excellent job, adding jokes, makes it, the MC, but a virtual MC. Yeah.
Someone has to really lead those things. Yeah.
But she was funny. She did it really well. Like it was really good. And so she organized games. So everything that she did, I mean, we were 3 hours all on the internet, like with all these, we use Zoom, like all there, like interacting. So that was very successful. And the other thing that made it very successful is that, the team actually sent to everyone, a wine bottle and some goodies and some things. So there was also like a physical interaction while doing it. So night and day of the software and then the actual, emceeing an event. And actually, I think it created quite a nice vibe and mood.
And the intentionality and planning that goes behind it. I think that's something that a lot of people are learning, and we've sort of touched on in a previous episode, where things like this, sometimes it feels like they're just happening naturally and it's working, but often there's someone that's put a lot of intention and a lot of time into planning and making sure that something like that is facilitated really well, especially if the team aren't feeling too motivated to kind of do it intrinsically. So that's really great. That's a great story. I'm really happy for you that worked so well.
Yeah, so the halfway one was actually a very recent one. I think it's closer to the higher than the lower.
Okay.
So we had an OKR session. So OKR is the performance tool that we use at Limehome. Quite new for us as an organization. First time we actually use OKRs to basically set goals and targets. And we did it all while being virtual. So we organized during 2 weeks a kind of OKR session fair where we reviewed all the OKRs from other areas shared them. We had Q&As and questions. And while doing everything remotely, it was actually quite effective with all the different sessions. So we organized like an initial session, that we had a coffee chat, and then we had a beers where we actually had different Q&As about different OKRs. And we were able to replicate a lot of the interaction that would happen while being physically, or of something that is quite important, after reviewing like 6 months of work. But there we did lack a tiny bit of the physical interaction to make it really, really top. But definitely it's closer to the Christmas party than a pure virtual setting. So
that's great.
Yeah, no, we're learning for sure. But people take for granted how much preparation needs to happen. Huh?
Absolutely.
And this fundamental and especially young companies, like they take it for granted completely.
It's often a thankless task as well, being that person that has to kind of be really resilient and kind of push people to engage. Especially, I mean, I'm not saying your team was unmotivated, but I know like there are situations where when a team is kind of lacking in connection with one another and motivation to socialize, and they just kind of want to do the job and leave. And this can be in an offline culture as well, of course. Being someone who's trying to re-engage and animate those people can be such a difficult task. And I really admire people that do that successfully.
Yeah, no, agreed.
The State of Work is brought to you by Lano. Lano makes it easy to hire the best talent on the planet. Companies of any size can hire and pay employees in more than 150 countries. Backed by a network of top employers of record, Lano takes care of compliant contracts, local tax law, and international payments. From full-time to freelance, the Lano platform has everything you need to grow your global team. Find out more at lano.io. Do you have some tips on how to get the most out of your team when you're distributed and in different places? I know you've had a lot of experience managing people across many countries and time zones, particularly when you've got people on different time zones. it just must be quite a task. And I'd love to hear your advice to people who might be struggling with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's three things that I've focused on my career to kind of help manage remote teams. From a manager's perspective and also from a company perspective. The first one, which I touched upon before, was using a good tool for measuring performance. And specifically, we use OKRs. I've used it now in three different companies where it's something very tangible, something that you can measure, and then something that can be shared very easily amongst the organization. So when an organization is remote based or spread out in different ways, you need to be able to share in an effective way, how to, what other people are doing. So I think OKRs fulfill both the giving purpose to an individual from a performance, being able to measure them objectively, as well as that sharing, which I'm a big fan of. So I think using OKRs is a really powerful tool. The second one, which I think it's not only for remote working, but I think it's even more important for remote working, is you really need to understand, what does an individual want to get out of their job, of what are their career aspirations, what are their objectives. I think it's a quality of good managers always to do that. But when you're remote, you need to actually spend more time on that. You need to not just have like a 30-minute catch up on performance tasks, what you're doing, but actually, how are you feeling? It's replacing that, water cooler conversation that, happens in the office, by doing it remotely. So you need to understanding and then making a specific plan for each of those individuals to make sure that they're happy and that they get the most out of. So, and if you develop that good relationship, they'll tell you, look, I'm missing the interaction with people. I'm missing, doing a job that's fun. I'm missing more client interaction, But I think it's fundamental having that open honesty between employee and manager, even more so when you're working remotely. And then the last one, which has been a growing pain for me, the 20 years that I've been working now, is regarding meetings. When you are working remotely, you end up potentially doing more meetings than you should. And I think actually that's been one of the learnings of the last 12 months for many people, that they're like, oh my God, we're in meetings all day. And especially when you're on video, it's even more tiring than when you were physically in meetings. But you need to make meetings much more effective when you're online. So we measure a lot more the impact of the meetings. We organize them a lot more. You always have a calendar of, what the purpose is, what the objectives are, and who the people are going to join. And if it doesn't fulfill that, you don't have the meeting, or you cancel the meeting, or you get rid of the meeting, or you modify it. When you're doing things virtually, it brings everything out in the light a lot more than when you do things physically, where you just drag in 10 people and you have a meeting. So kind of one of my big learnings is that I've actually reduced a lot the hours that I spend on meetings. I used to, in my past jobs, maybe spend 40% of all my work time on meetings. Now I would say it's about, 10%, 15%. And then I have sporadic ones, to solve problems. So you can jump on meetings or calls much more easier. But I think that one is something that, people need to learn and how to be more effective. And then when you're in a growth technology-based startup, it's a different culture from a corporate one, politics, how it works out, et cetera, which, luckily it makes it a lot more lean and smooth. But I'm a big fan of reducing the number of hours of meetings and actually being effective.
Yeah. I mean, that's also something a lot of people often say, like this, there's the meme, this email could have been, this meeting could have been an email. It's funny because just to add a personal anecdote, I, much earlier on in my career, I was in a team that very rarely had meetings. And actually we probably could have done with more to really align. And my view is sometimes like this email chain or like this Slack channel could have been a meeting, I think getting that balance right of like finding out what needs a meeting and what needs just an update. Like it's so crucial. Yeah, I think that's a really good tip. What about when you've got, several different time zones? How do you manage to schedule meetings? Do you end up doing a meeting with the team that's in the Northern Hemisphere and then a meeting with the team that's on the other side of the world? Or like, how have you managed that in the past?
That was a tricky one. And I had that issue for about 4 years in my previous job, where we had a team, based in the US. Luckily, they were Eastern Standard Time. Then we had India, and then we had the hub in Europe. We felt it was very important to have a global meeting where everyone got to interact. Initially, I made the mistake where it was too often. We did it weekly, and it was just too much of a work effort because it would be really early in the morning for the US, and then late at night in India. So we reduced it to once a month, and we were able to create that interaction, to create that bond between people. But then from an effectiveness perspective, it needs to be small numbers of groups. Like, we had this one meeting that ended up being about 20, 25 people at the end. It was ineffective. It was more of an update meeting.
Yeah.
I think I took too long, and I should have changed that into an email or potentially a Slack update. But I was using it as kind of way for people to interact and to get to know each other a little bit better, but not successfully. So it wasn't the right way to do it. But yeah, I don't think it can be forced. Meetings need to be a small number of people, and the time zones need to be respected, because if not, like, we end up working at 1 o'clock in the morning, at 6 a.m. and we're not effective in our day-to-day.
Yeah, and it's so hard to establish healthy boundaries with work when you've got that time shift of regularly working really late into the night.
Yeah, no, agreed. Luckily in Europe, I think we're spoiled that we're kind of like in the center of the time zone for many people. So we always, unless it's like a heavily Asia-focused company or heavily US-focused company, but the time zones in Europe are normally not too bad in general. It's the LA coast one and the sometimes Asia ones that get all completely out of whack.
Yeah, but it's good for, for any listeners who are kind of teetering on the edge of like maybe looking to hire in a completely different time zone, that it is possible. It's possible to get these things right. And it's just about sometimes trying and doing a bit of trial and error, and then listening to people like you who've kind of been doing it for 10 years and kind of know what works usually. So it's really great. So earlier you mentioned about hybrid teams, and that your view is that's probably the way most companies are going to be heading. Can you elaborate a little bit about that? Yeah, so
I think at the start of COVID, people were thinking, this is just something that's going to last, a couple of months. And then when things were getting advanced, people then went to the other extreme, like, everyone's going to go remote. And then companies were starting to tell people to go back into the office. And then, some of the companies telling, you never need to go back to the office. But I think there's a kind of a built up consensus that it's going to be some sort of hybrid work model. And by hybrid work model, I mean that there'll always be some sort of office. They're probably going to be smaller. There's going to be probably more impact of co-working spaces for even smaller companies. But it's a place where people will be able to go and interact and work and spend time together. But the fact that you'll be able to work 1, 2, 3, 4 days from home, I don't think is going to disappear. And I think it makes it even more important to take into account that to hire top talent, you're going to have to offer these things, because we saw that it worked for 1 year. We saw that some people were even more effective, and you were able to lower your costs. So why take away something that works well, people enjoy? It just doesn't make sense. So this hybrid work model, which is kind of what we're pushing at Limehome as we grow with different countries, and definitely with how we're testing out in Spain, is we're always going to have a fixed spot where everyone can go. I'm planning on going a couple of days of the week when anyone needs me to join. You'll have more of a social interaction in a lot of these places. But in order to hire top talent, you're going to have to offer that possibility of working from home. And even if you offer the possibility of, let's say you're not even in the city. So for example, our head of business development is based in Malaga. He comes to Madrid once every 2 times a month or 1 time a month, for meetings to interact with the team. From a cost perspective, it makes complete sense. You're able to attract that talent, you're able to retain that talent. So I think companies there'll be a shift in the way they do things in order to adapt to employees' needs in a way that they never really thought about it before. So I think it'll be very interesting how this hybrid model plays out, how different structures will come into play to allow for the social interaction that maybe doesn't happen as much in an office. And then what will be eliminated is a lot of these short trips that were just for a business trip. for like one day or like even for like a 2-hour meeting. And what will increase will be a lot more of that social interaction, going back to headquarters, spending time with headquarters to interact, to spend time with the culture, to absorb, which I think makes a lot of sense for creating solid and powerful companies.
Do you see any risks involved in terms of like if you've got a hybrid team and some people are required to be in the office and some aren't? I don't know. Do you see any risks there or like?
So it's a very valid point, and I think we're all still learning. So I think the main thing is you need to be able to, as long as you can measure performance, and as long as you're doing what you need to do, because there are some roles that you need to go more into the office. It's just the way that it is. Just some roles that need to travel more. More client interaction. So I think people need to like self-reflect. There needs to be transparency in the organization. The rules need to be set for everyone the same. But then everyone needs to take into account what their role means and what that impacts for a day-to-day. I'm sure there's going to be issues that will be raised. I am sure there'll be a lot of like small gossip conversations, especially in larger companies that that could create problems in the future. And this is where about maturity, over communicating, culture, transparency all come into play to make it successful. But the main thing is, like, if you really look at these last 12 months, is we've been able to perform well while working remotely. Before, we thought that people would be slackers. It was only a few random people like myself that work remotely. And we had to actually overcompensate sometimes for communication, overcompensate for traveling. And now that's not needed as much because everyone else is doing it and people are responding. So it's a big change, but I think there are some companies that will suffer, which don't have a strong culture, which don't set good guidelines, which don't, communicate well. But I think most will be really successful. I think people will just be happier, which is something great for society in general.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's so many resources out there for people who want to learn how to manage teams that are remote or partly remote. So I think it's just all about learning and being open to learning.
Yeah.
Do you have any last tips for anyone who's maybe in a similar position to where you were a year ago, where they're trying to scale a pretty new business when they themselves are remote and separate from the rest of their team?
I mean, the key is to give it a shot. Yeah. Don't be scared. There'll always be, 10 things you can think of that could go wrong. But it can be done. I'm not the only person that's done this. There's been thousands of companies that have been created remotely during this crisis, and there's probably be like tens of thousands more that will be created. So my advice would be, take a risk. Don't be scared. If you only find the negatives, you'll never move forward. There'll always be more negatives at the start than positives. But there's a lot of things that can be added by working remotely, from making use of time, just being efficient, and just the quality of life that one can have. I mean, in the last 10 years, I've reduced about an hour of commute every single day, 5 times a week. I mean, that's, I don't know, thousands and thousands of hours that I've saved in my life that I get to dedicate to other things, reading, learning more, spending time with friends, spending time with family, my kids. So, don't be scared.
I think that's a really wonderful reminder as well. If you're working remotely or you're working from home, make the most of it and enjoy it, because you've got an opportunity to change your lifestyle a little bit and do live where you want to live and be where you be doing, spending the time on the other things that make you happy.
For sure. So thank you a lot for this chance to share my thoughts and
thank you
and reflections of the last 10 years and the last year.
Yeah, so thank you. It's been really, really great to have you on the podcast. The State of Work is available wherever you listen to podcasts. Find us on Instagram or Twitter by searching for The State of Work. We'd love to hear from you. For more information on anything we talked about in this episode and links to further reading, check out our show notes at podcast.lano.io. Thanks for listening and see you next time on The State of Work.